I'm Dan Borsha. We're coming to you from Rubibi, Broome on Yaru country. And to start this show from his land, our panellist Yarraman Bart Pigram is here to invite us to his country with an acknowledgement of his people's ancient and enduring connection here. Over to you, Bart.
Thanks, Dan. I would like to acknowledge my elders, past, present and emerging. I would like to acknowledge the beautiful country that we are sitting on and talking on the drum here today, called Rubibi and Girrigan and many other place names around this area. More closer is adjacent to us, a place called Dired Gun, a very, very significant site of archaeology and anthropology, and also a mythological site as well. I'd also like to pay respects to our ancestors, elders, for continuing on our culture that we are living and are very proud of today here in Broome. Thank you.
And Bart, thank you, and we certainly echo those acknowledgements and are grateful for you for sharing a snapshot of the place that we are coming to you from and that acknowledgement of your country. And it's really great to have you on the panel as well. Bart Pigram is the business owner-operator at Naligia Experiences Broome. Also joining me on the panel tonight, chairperson of Galganium Limited, Kia Dowell. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
COO of Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services, Jenny Bedford. Great to have you along.
It's good to be here.
And financial counsellor at Bush Money Mob, Alan Gray. Welcome along.
Thanks, Dan.
And of course, as always, you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook as well. Yeah, we're here in Broome, a vibrant town with a spectacular beach. You can probably see it over my shoulder, which was once the largest pearling port on the planet. It's also the gateway to the Kimberley, renowned as one of the most spectacular and untouched wilderness areas in the world. A tourist mecca, Broome and the Kimberley has faced a challenging few years following COVID lockdowns and border closures. And the flooding that decimated parts of the Kimberley earlier this year has also hit communities and hit them hard. As the wet season comes to a close, we're here to learn from locals about the issues affecting those people who are living here. One of those issues is housing, and the Reserve Bank decided to leave interest rates unchanged today, which will no doubt come as welcome relief for many borrowers. But one of the reasons the RBA cited for not hiking rates today is the financial stress yet to hit households, as those previous interest rate hikes are passed on by the commercial banks. As David Taylor explains, the cost of keeping a roof over your head keeps climbing, and combined with a lack of housing is producing a housing crisis that's likely to worsen.
The great Australian dream of home ownership has become a nightmare for millions of Australians.
$1,210,000.
New research highlights the serious hurdles many Australians need to clear to secure rental accommodation and buy a home. The government-run National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation has released a report highlighting the root causes behind the housing crisis. It's found that a surge in population fuelled by a rise in migration has significantly increased demand for housing. At the same time, decade-high construction costs and higher interest rates have slowed the construction of new housing. The report says there'll be a shortfall of 106,000 new dwellings by 2027 and 79,000 homes over the next decade.
Going!
Analysts say this chronic shortage of housing means the price of existing homes will remain steady or even rise.
With the opening of the borders, the massive increase in migration, we've seen a rather large rise in underlying demand for real estate, and that's been playing out in the rental market, as everyone's well aware.
And Louis Christopher says we've now got a full-blown national rental crisis. In Sydney, rents in several outer local government areas increased more than 30% from early 2020 to January 2023, and more than 3 times that of some inner-city LGAs. The expectation now is that without significant policy intervention, Australia's housing crisis is set to worsen.
We've got issues on that front, and unfortunately what it is going to mean, and I think we're starting to see anecdotal evidence, is that it's going to play out pretty badly on the poor. We are going to see a rise in homelessness, and that's concerning. That represents deep social issues.
So, Bart, give me a sense of what the cost of living pressures and that stress is putting on families and their bottom lines here.
Well, I think it's, for us here in Broome and the Kimberley region, overcrowding is a massive issue already amongst our Indigenous communities. And so, obviously, that's going to, the cost of living is going to increase that sort of pressure on households. And probably increase the numbers of people living in one house itself. I've seen it through family and friends, friends from out of town that have moved to Broome, really struggling to find accommodation, and then more finding accommodation but being able to pay for that rent. My partner, fiancé, has just recently bought a house which was pretty much pressured into because there was no other place to rent in the last year or so.
So that was bought in order to find somewhere to live?
Exactly, yeah. In order for her to keep her job and stay in Broome and continue working, she had to go to the extreme, and she was obviously fortunate enough to be able to have and look to buying a house. But you also might want to look at Nyambulburi having a housing initiative and project here in Broome, and trying to increase the numbers of Aboriginal-owned home ownership.
What is that program?
I'm not sure what the name of it is, but Nyambulburi is the native title Aboriginal corporation here that does a lot of the corporate business for Yawuru community, and we have a home ownership initiative that is put through there. So it'd be interesting to see how those numbers have risen in the last years with the cost of living back then to now, and maybe probably seeing a major drop in Aboriginal people being interested in home ownership.
Yeah. Kia, interest rates were left on hold today. You're a homeowner here. How do you feel about that news?
Relieved, but I also pretty realistic in that it's only temporary. I think from what we've seen in the last 12 months and from a Kimberley perspective, we know that about 14% in the last census is the home ownership rate of Aboriginal people in the region, compared to something like 50% for non-Aboriginal people. That, coupled with the points that Bart has touched on, really does apply pressure downwards in our communities. And as a result, I think what we're seeing is families and individuals really struggling to make ends meet day to day. And some of the work that Galganyam, which is the organisation that I chair, along with many other Aboriginal organisations, I imagine, across the region, are looking at ways that we can intervene. So we've set up, emergency funds, health and wellbeing funds. We're looking to Bart's point around how we can support traditional owners to get into the housing market. And that's something that has come out of necessity. I think the other thing we need to realise and acknowledge is that the demographics of the Kimberley really talk to some of the entrenched disadvantage that we've seen play out over decades. And an interesting stat for the panel is that when we look at the makeup of families, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this region, we see a really high proportion of single carer and single parent families, which is disproportionate to non-Aboriginal people, and I'm sure that we're yet to really feel the impact of that. We know that Perth, just bringing kind of the homelessness, it's a rough sleeping capital of Australia, just announced recently. We will feel the impact of that as well, Dan. I think we're yet to feel that. I welcome the pause on the interest rate rise, but I think we've probably got another 12 to 18 months to really feel the true impact on our mob here.
And to see where that flows. And there's a couple of points there that I want to pick up on throughout this conversation, particularly around the links between housing and health. But first, Jenny, yesterday there were 22 properties available for rent across the entire Greater Broome region. I wondered, do you see a correlation between the low rates and vacancies of houses and then the impacts of people not being able to find places to live and having to buy places here?
Yeah, look, from a health perspective, we know that our people get sick for a reason, and some of the underlying causes of that is having access to a healthy home and food security, being able to eat good, healthy food all of the time, not just some of the time. What we see from a primary health perspective, environmental health is a key component of the way that we deliver services under our model of care to our communities in the Kimberley. And so the lack of access and availability of good housing for our communities is a very high risk factor in being able to close the health equity gap between Aboriginal communities and non-Aboriginal communities. Our community in the Kimberley is grappling with rheumatic heart disease, which is an entirely preventable disease, but it's a risk factor comes about as a result of overcrowding and then the impact that has on the health hardware, so the taps, the showers, the toilets, when you've got 20 people living in a home. And without proper treatment, it can cause death, and that treatment includes a very painful needle that has to be given monthly. So we're seeing the effects of lack of appropriate housing and also the lack of good, healthy food for our mob in the Kimberley. It's a key component, the social determinants of health, and we grapple with that every day. And essentially what they are is what you wake up to in the morning. Do I have running water? Can I feed my children breakfast and send them off to school and get a good education so that they can get a job in the future and be able to participate in the economy as any other non-Aboriginal person would? And housing is a key component of that, and environmental health plays a key part in the way that we deliver services in the Kimberley.
Yeah, there's so many factors that compound there. Alan, I wonder, when you hear the news today that there's going to be that pause in rate rises, what does that say to you? Because you've got 3 adult children, I understand, who are all living at home because of the very housing situation we're hearing about today.
Well, yes, that's true, Dan, but, we're a comfortable Guttier family in urban Broome. All of my clients are in remote Aboriginal communities where I think only 2 people out of 350 clients have home mortgages. And people are forced into this incredible overcrowding in remote communities all through the Kimberley and the East Pilbara where we work. But what irritates me is that as a population we've blindly accepted that interest rates are the only lever for the government to control inflation. But economists at the Australia Institute in Canberra on the 1st of March released a study that showed that 69% of all the inflation that we're currently grappling with, which is having a shocking impact on food prices, power prices, petrol prices and rent for people, 69% of that inflation is caused by excess profits from large corporations, gouging higher prices above what inflation has caused them to pass on. $160 billion in excess profits from these large corporations, and only 18% of the inflation is caused by what people imagine as a wage prices spiral. So I think, unfortunately, the people bearing the brunt of this current inflation crisis are the most disadvantaged on the continent, and it makes me quite cranky that this is not understood in Canberra.
Or is it that it's not understood, or that it's much easier to be having conversations about cost of living, interest rates, even as tough as they are, than the alternative, which it sounds like you're suggesting, which is, some sort of super profits taxes or some other levers, to borrow your term?
Absolutely. Even a Conservative government in the UK in the past 6 months has brought in a windfall resources tax for gas and oil companies. We've seen the same thing in Australia. Giant corporations like Santos, etc., making massive super profits. In the UK, they've brought in a 35% tax on those super profits. That money could go to housing in the Kimberley or Cape York or Alice Springs or all the other disadvantaged areas that have been shockingly neglected by successive governments.
Yeah. Kia, I saw you nodding along when Alan was talking about the very low number of people with mortgages out of those that are talking to him and seeking that assistance. Is another part of this a discussion about housing and getting into the market that your organisation, and as Bart was touching on, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations are getting in to look at how can they be pulling those levers to lead to home ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great point, Dan, because what we're seeing is, in the absence of those levers that Alan touched on, we're seeing Aboriginal organisations, community-controlled organisations step up, make the hard decisions and take what limited resources or limited capital that we have and actually redirecting it to where the need is based on what our communities, beneficiaries or members are telling us. Access to housing is a hurdle for everyday Australians, but when you look at what's happening in regional and remote communities, that is exaggerated because of the existing lack of supply, lack of maintenance, all of these issues that they're not new issues, but they are compounded in the current environment. So for organisations like NBY, like Galganyum, and numerous others across the region, we're now looking at funding those solutions ourselves. Ideally, we would love to be able to do that in partnership with government or with impact investors so that we are able to really maximise the money that is out there. As Ellen touched on there, it's not a lack of money, it's actually looking at how you target the investment in a way that will assist our mob into home ownership. We know that there are real outcomes from a health point of view, and if we just keep applying these band-aids, but we're not actually going to get to the root cause and address the real symptoms that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, and that's the problem, isn't it? That then it's about dealing with symptoms rather than the cause. Jenny, when there aren't enough places for people to live and we have the overcrowding that Bart touched on right at the start, what happens from a health perspective then?
Look, a number of things, and I've spoken about RHC and the impact of that, but if I could switch now and talk about what happened from a COVID perspective during the recent outbreaks. One of the things that remote communities really struggled with was to identify housing to isolate COVID positive patients. And what that really led to was, the potential that from a public health perspective that, that sickness would spread a lot more quickly through community. And it really made it very clear to us at CAMS, but also within our member services, that housing was a privilege and not a right. And we see it as, in our model of care, as an absolute right. We live in a resource-rich state. These are, our community members deserve the opportunity to live in safe homes that accommodate the family. The other thing that I'd just like to point out from a health perspective in terms of housing is the difficulty that our colleagues that work in environmental health and specifically Nurrumbuk Environmental Health Services in providing that sort of, repair and maintenance and upkeep. And that comes from, the vast distances that they need to travel to get from, the major centres of Broome and Kununurra, but into communities to assist with upgrades, to work alongside community to make sure that, taps are working, that washers are changed. And in some respects, I think we've got to change the paradigm in terms of, shifting the power and resources from government into Aboriginal community control. And what the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap did in the priority reforms is it gives us levers to actually negotiate with government around how that might look like.
And mechanisms of accountability as well, isn't it?
Yes. Aboriginal community-controlled health services and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations are accountable to their communities by virtue of their memberships, but also because we are Kimberley people. And so even though we might work in an Aboriginal organisation, we're also accountable to our community.
And more so, I was meaning the government accountability to the community-controlled health, because that's something that hasn't always been there, has it?
No, it hasn't. What we saw through COVID in terms of the responses from health in the planning, but also in the responses, was our services sitting at the decision-making table with state government, so the WA Country Health Service, WA Health, WA Police Service, and Foreign Emergency, to really map out and plan how we were going to respond to COVID outbreaks. But I have to say, a practical example of the priority reforms in practice was the amazing advocacy that our national peak, NACHO, did to negotiate with the federal government to put in place enacting legislation which allowed us to close remote communities. And that gave us time and space on the ground to actually work with those remote communities to then frame their responses. And a lot of the remote communities, Bidjatanga and Beagle Bay, for example, what they knew about response planning was how do they respond to cyclones. So they framed a lot of their response planning around COVID on what they knew, which was cyclone planning. So through the COVID responses by community, it was really great to see how you could use those levers of change to make sure that community and community leadership were front and centre in those negotiations with government.
Kia, before you mentioned about some of the statistics and the facts about who is living in houses, and I wanted to put to you about this point about caring for elders and extended family and other members of the family and broader community. Does this raise questions about housing design, suitability as well? And I guess underpinning all of this is housing one of the levers to be dealing with intergenerational, I guess the broad disadvantage.
It's a really interesting question, because when we look at the mix of housing, if you look at the housing continuum from, say, social housing to home ownership, there's different needs for different cohorts. And when we look at Aboriginal people in the Kimberley and what our needs are, we know that we are often faced with challenges around economic participation, because we don't have a long history of intergenerational wealth, let alone the ability to build from, our parents' generation. I mean, I reflect on my own experience, and we lived on community. That even if we wanted to purchase or build in community, while technically it's possible, it's also laced with red tape. There's lots of hurdles to jump through. So even for mob living in community, we're often restricted because policy settings are not conducive or enable us to be able to realise that dream. So we're often told what the deal is before we've even had an opportunity to have input into that. And I would just like to touch on infrastructure. The role of infrastructure, I think, is really important. Housing is one part of that. If we look at COVID and the response and leadership from our community-controlled organisations across the region, one thing that became really clear is that we need to know what role we play and what our obligations are from a community point of view. So whether it's a cyclone, a flood that breaks down this one piece of critical infrastructure, it doesn't take much for this region to be left quite vulnerable. And housing, I think what we're seeing now play out is that housing is an issue that is and requires us to look at it from a rights-based approach. So what are the basic human rights that we all are afforded with or should be afforded with?
I think that's a really interesting point about infrastructure, Kia, because it reminds me that I was looking at infrastructure spending by the current federal government in the latest budget. $4.9 billion devoted to one road in South Australia, the Torrens to Darlington Road. Now, if you live in Torrens and you're listening tonight, you think, great, $4.9 billion, that's half what the federal government is currently putting on the table for its $10 billion social housing fund for the entire continent. So on one hand, we've got one road in Adelaide, and on the other hand, we've got the entire social housing budget for a whole continent. So it's no wonder that the crossbench is kicking up and saying this is chicken feed. It is chicken feed, and Mr Albanese needs to hear that message. He was in the Kimberley, in Fitzroy Crossing on the 9th of January. He's seen the impact on the rundown public housing stock in one community. He needs to put serious money on the table, not a measly $10 billion.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a starting point, one that we're going to be having more conversations about. Here in the Kimberley, the dry season's fast approaching. It's peak season for the tourist mecca. Well, that was until the pandemic hit, when the state's border closures put the brakes on the lucrative industry. Now, the state government's pushing hard to get visitors back, dedicating millions in funding to encourage tourists to visit the Kimberley this winter. Flooding at the beginning of the year, which has just been touched on, has caused some, literal roadblocks. But Paula O'Brien from Australia's Northwest Tourism is confident the sector is back on track.
Tourism is very important for the region and in the northwest as a whole. So between Broome, the Kimberley and the Pilbara, there are about 7,800 people employed in tourism, and that's about 8.8% of the workforce. In the wet season in this region, we usually experience a lot of rain. Every year we have road closures, every year we have flooding. But what happened in January was much more impactful. For this season, we're expecting 2 of our national parks that are in the Fitzroy Valley to remain shut. What we've seen for the tourism industry in terms of the flood relief funding has been really positive. We've seen an initiative to get people excited about going out and doing tourism experiences, whether that's in Broome, doing tours here, or across the Kimberley and into Connemara as well. Access across the Kimberley is currently being restored, and we've already seen the first cars cross the river at Fitzroy Crossing, which is so exciting to see. I think we have some incredibly out-of-this-world iconic places to visit. So people think of the beehive-striped domes in the bungalows. We've got Wolf Creek Crater just sitting out there at the edge of the desert, and the 4 tiers of the Mitchell Falls along the coastline. There are certainly wonderful places to visit. Coming out of the last couple of years of COVID as well, they've had a lot of deferred bookings, a lot of cancellations. Certainly they were looking forward to having a really great year this year. I still think it will be a great year this year, but it's just a little bit of extra work to get there.
But your bread and butter is the tourism industry. Just how important is it for you?
Really, Dan, it's sort of a social enterprise, a cultural enterprise. It's not so much based about business and making $1 million. I'd wish, but it's more about the continuous day-to-day cultural practice and preservation. And also access and being present on country. So right behind us is one of the locations where I do tours. So I'm quite comfortable here, but. It is a lifestyle, but it's got so much more benefits than just being a job. There's the empowerment. There's the like I said, the cultural practice and ongoing preservation of it.
Can I just ask on that? What does it mean for you to be able to share and preserve your culture by bringing other people in?
Well, first of all, it's a national trend to be learning Aboriginal culture and language because, unfortunately, our country hasn't been respectful and embracing the Aboriginal culture and language. Actually, been on the other side of it, where it's been exploited in many cases. But we've got a position now as Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to be sitting there defining how we share that, what we share and where we share it. And that's why it's so much more than just a job or an enterprise for money. There's so many more benefits to it, and I'm really, really passionate about it. I'll advocate it if I'm not even in the game anymore. But it is such an empowering position to be in, really guiding people through our country and identifying certain cultural and historical significance that we want to share. When we talk about truth-telling in a national sense, we do it on the ground. And I'd say roughly over 1,000 people that I would take on a tour throughout the year. That's over 1,000 people that I genuinely and first-handedly connect to, telling the truth and sharing our culture right there with them.
And for anyone who's unfamiliar, at the very start when you were acknowledging your country and your elders, you talked about a sacred site not far from here. There will be people wondering whether it's okay when they visit sacred sites. Now, usually that's not the case. What do you say about how to navigate what can be shared and what can't be?
Yeah, so the site there, I've been very, very fortunate enough to be the Cultural Development Project Officer at Nyambulburi Yarra for several years, about 7 years ago. And through there, I was able to connect with most of our elders on country and be told what is sacred, significant, and places I can and can't go. There are places that I've never taken to guests or visitors ever, and I will never do that.
Because of the importance of those and
exactly.
what they mean in the living culture.
Exactly, and our responsibility as younger generational people are to uphold those values and those rules, those laws. But the empowering thing is that we don't we don't have to go there. We can go to somewhere else that is appropriate. And so I truly have to say that it's an empowering industry to be in, is cultural tourism.
It's such a great way to explain it. Jenny, when you hear listening to that, I saw you nodding away. What sort of opportunities does this sector then provide to First Nations business owners, staff, and what's the flow-on of that as well?
I can really hear the passion in Bart's voice, and I loved it. I love it because, well, look, we know the value proposition of tourism in the Kimberley. It's about our people, our culture, our beautiful and rugged landscapes, the remoteness and, the distances that we all take for granted when we jump in the car and drive. But I also just want to say that, tourism and economic development and the way that, Bart spoke about his business, they really go to the heart of not just the social determinants of health, but also the cultural determinants of health. And they are really critical factors that we often talk about in our model of care and how we deliver services. And what we see with a lot of the tourism ventures is our men that are leading that. And it's really wonderful to see because it creates opportunities for our men to become involved in terms of, that real economy about, having a good job to go to and being able to contribute to society. And I think that that's a really important one for us from the health perspective, but especially around the social and cultural determinants of health.
Yeah.
Speaking as a financial counsellor, I think Bart deserves a lot of plaudits for the way he has pioneered the very visible image of Aboriginal tourism in our region. When you land at Broome Airport, you see a tourism video with Bart's face, and every time I see that, I think, thanks, Bart. Thanks for welcoming me home, and I love it. And I've had the joy to be on a couple of Bart's tours, and they are very, very special events. And you come away feeling great because you learn more about the cultural footprint of where you're lucky enough to live. And I think pretty much everyone I've ever met who lives in Broome feels a great deal of good fortune to be able to live on this Yawuru Jugun land. And most people in Broome have a deep level of respect for Yawuru and Jugun culture. But like most Australians, whitefellas like us, we don't know very much about Aboriginal culture. And I see this in tourism, that tourists who are coming here, they're hungry for an authentic Indigenous experience. And I don't want to sound negative, the only thing that bothers me is that I feel like the West Australian tourism industry is very happy to have photogenic, good-looking young men like Bart spearheading their videos, but I sometimes wonder what percentage of the tourism industry profits return to Aboriginal pockets, because I fear that large companies based in Sydney, Melbourne, overseas are pocketing a lot of the tourism dollars. And I would love to see the small family enterprises that we've seen on the Dampier Peninsula north of here popping up through the central and the East Kimberley as well. And I think there's a model there, but it needs strong support from government, because people have so much going on in their daily lives that Bart is a rare breed to be able to create a family-owned tourism business from scratch. It's really impressive.
Yeah, just on that, I think, there's, and this is probably going to be affected by the cost of living as well, with the fact that it's probably not a good space to jump into tourism because not many people are going to be coming because it costs too much. But just on that, Alan, as Australia is progressing and Aboriginal people have been given more opportunities. I used this a couple of years ago when I was on the Waitok board, and just that the time is now, for people that are interested to get into tourism, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, to get into tourism, talking about the government, the state government, with a lot of arm wrestling through Waitok and advocacy through Waitok, have now, they've contributed and funded the largest amount of dollars towards Aboriginal tourism, and that's why we've got business development managers and assistants here in Broome at the office here. But we need I say this, I don't know whether it's correct, but a universal investment. Now, the government can do its part, the individual operator can do its part, and the family can do their part. But where are all our other places that are throwing money around and are giving lots of money for Indigenous and Aboriginal empowerment and employment and training? Where's our education facilities? Where's our TAFEs?
Exactly. I often daydream about a residential college of tourism. Imagine.
Why not?
It would just be brilliant. But that's only one little idea. But you can just see in other industries where that's worked. The wine industry in South Australia.
The point that you both just made now is that when you're having conversations, it's where outcomes, when everyone's at the table. And I guess this is the big conversation we're having as a nation right now, isn't it? All Australians are just months away from deciding whether to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the nation's constitution. We know the government has introduced legislation into Parliament to set the terms of the looming referendum, which will happen later this year. While some preliminary polling suggests majority support for the changes, in Western Australia's Kimberley views are less clear-cut. ABC Kimberley reporter Tallulah Bindry caught up with locals to find out what the voice to Parliament might mean to them at the grassroots.
Jaru man Donnie Imbalong is an environmental scientist from the East Kimberley. He's used to governments making big promises but not delivering, and he fears the proposed voice to Parliament won't be any different.
Another lengthy process that's going to cost a lot of money, money that could have already gone towards grassroots projects in remote communities and regional towns.
Donnie is passionate about preserving traditional lands and the culture of the people that call it home. But many who live here are among the most vulnerable in the nation.
The social issues and stuff, it seems to be getting, worse every couple of generations.
He's generally sceptical about whether the voice will deliver tangible benefits in the Kimberley and fears it could be a toothless tiger.
They have no real power. If the government wants to enact another heavy-handed policy, the voice could object to it, but the government can choose to ignore them.
Thousands of kilometres away, in the nation's capital, talks about how the voice would work are well and truly underway.
Legislation that was introduced.
And the Kimberley Land Council, WA's most influential land rights body, has a prominent seat at the table.
We need to get an understanding of what the voice means for us, so we're here to actually hear firsthand what it's entailed.
Anthony Watson is among leaders who firmly believe now is the time to push forward. He recognises there are still important questions that need to be answered about the voice, particularly when it comes to meaningful grassroots representation.
Our organisation has conducted a lot of ground meetings, bush meetings, to actually hear the voice of our people, our members, and what their concerns.
With so many different views about what the voice should look like back here in the Kimberley, in researching this story, it's become clear that no two groups share the same vision and ideas about its delivery. While some people have some reservations and others are on the fence, there are some people that feel more empowered than ever at the prospect of a formal voice. Jodie Bell has lived in the West Kimberley for more than 3 decades and runs one of the most prominent Aboriginal media organisations in the state's north.
Hey, Manny, just wanted to check. Did you
The Butchulla and Jagera woman is hopeful a voice could help right historical wrongs.
I am a supporter of The Voice. I was involved in the Uluru Dialogue at the time a couple of years ago when it came out.
And to all you Broome mob, stick around because coming up for you next.
Historically, when we've had a say in determining our future, that's when things have worked well. When we haven't had that say, it's when things haven't worked well.
For the first time in her life, she feels like Aboriginal people are on the verge of seeing meaningful change.
I see The Voice as a good first step. We don't have the enshrined voice in Parliament that we need to make everlasting and long-lasting change. I don't think it's the only step, but I definitely think it's a step in the right direction.
Tallulah Bindry there reporting and hearing lots of different perspectives on The Voice. And I'll get into more of that conversation in a moment. But just yesterday, we heard the news that Yunupingu had passed in Arnhem Land, a champion of the land rights movement and a pioneer, really, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. And I wanted to open it up to the panel for some thoughts just on Yunupingu's passing first. Jenny, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that it was with profound sadness that I read that news yesterday, because that old man was such a giant in the fight for rights for not just his community but, communities all across Australia. And that fight for rights included that self-determining right that we have as Aboriginal people to make decisions that affect us. And so I'm just so sad that he won't get that opportunity to see what happens when the voice goes to a referendum. But I would like to send my deepest sympathies to his family and extended family.
Yeah, and particularly given his role on the referendum working group, and also arguably it was his call some decades ago that even put constitutional recognition in this conversation on any agenda, let alone the national one. Bart, I wonder if you had...
Yeah, I'd just love to pay my respects to my sis Liziga and Bevan and the family of the Yunupingu mob there in Yolngu country. And as a younger person, we look back at legends that spearheaded a lot of the Aboriginal rights of Australia, and definitely Mr. Yunupingu was one of those people. And I'll back up Jenny in saying it's sad, really sad, that he doesn't get to see, going to the referendum and the results of that for all the hard work. And I'll touch on a bit later that we've got the remaining elders and leaders that are there that have built their life's work on Indigenous human rights, Aboriginal rights in Australia, we younger people like us, we got a lot of big shoes to fill in the coming years after the referendum.
Alan, you've spent time working on Yolngu country. What are your reflections?
Yes, I was privileged enough to spend a couple of years working out of East Arnhem Land, and a lot of people I dealt with were Yunupingu clan members, and I extend my condolences to all of the people of the Yunupingu family. And what's really clear to me, Dan, is that when I was working with the Yunupingu people, they have a pride and a strength knowing that they were right in their culture. And for me, as a young white fella growing up in Australia, being inspired by reading about the Bark Petition in 1967, one of the inspirations for Eddie Mabo to take on the whole concept of terra nullius was because the Bark Petition was knocked back. And to go to Yirakala in the art centre in the heart of Yolngu country and see the replica of the Bark Petition, it's very, very inspiring. So I feel deeply sorry for the family and for the wider Yolngu people at the moment. It's a great loss to our country.
And Kia, I'm keen to get your reflections as well, and perhaps about the lessons that Yunupingu taught other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people about how to be working within the system to get what you need around navigating land rights and care of land and country.
Yeah, I mean, I echo the other panellists' sentiment. I'm deeply grateful for his leadership, for the role that he played for younger Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around this country. Without his daring, shall we say rebellious, but that was really necessary at the time, and not just when you reflect on what happened in 67, but what that seeded generations later for now. And I'm really deeply grateful and pay my respects from my mob over in the East Kimberley, and thank his family and his community for continuing to advocate. Our experience in the East Kimberley right now absolutely is grounded in those principles of human rights, cultural rights and obligations, and what we're navigating in real time is a negotiation around mine closure. And during his tenure as chair of the NLC, we can see and take lessons from how he led with courage, with grace, but real grit, and never feeling like he had to compromise on his cultural values. And that is something that I lean on quite a lot in my discussions around the closure with industry as well.
Yeah, that's such powerful points. And I just want to add from the team and I, our deepest condolences to the Yunupingu family and pay our deep respect to the legacy and leadership that the old man made in our country to give others voices, and voices is exactly where I want to go now. But I wonder if you're seeing a level of engagement around this discussion about the voice to Parliament.
I would have liked to have seen more. Maybe I just wasn't present, or it wasn't. There wasn't enough energy and support put back to it. But you know, I obviously being part of the Aboriginal community here and talking to a lot of people, there are a lot of concerns that there was a strong lack of engagement and didn't reach.
Was this leading up to the Uluru process, or since then?
Not so much. It's probably after the Uluru process, but even the meeting that happened in Alice Springs, it was those lucky few that were able to actually get to that. A lot of people. I'm not sure what the numbers were that were actually at the to provide the statement and contribute to that.
1,200 contributed across 12 meetings.
Yep. So, I know that a lot of people didn't even know it was on. They still don't know today. And is it their fault that they don't know? They are Aboriginal people that should be informed more. Is the information not getting out to our communities? I don't know.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point. And Jenny, do you think that there is the right or enough conversations happening across First Nations communities and the broader Australian community about this big political debate?
Yeah, look, I think there is support for the voice, but I echo some of Bart's comments around how it will be implemented is still a little bit unclear for some communities. But what I know is that when you put Aboriginal people at the centre of policy making and co-design and delivery of programs to our communities, your chance of success in terms of getting outcomes is markedly higher than having, the age-old challenge of policies being developed in Canberra centrally and rolled out into remote Australia. So if I could just talk about the COVID response and how that played out, because I think that demonstrates how when community control is at the centre, you actually save lives, but you also save money, and you have our people sitting at the decision making table, making decisions about issues that affect us. Our CEO and our medical director, Vicky O'Donnell and Dr. Lorraine Anderson, worked extremely hard in their advocacy to make sure that CAMS and our member services were at the decision-making table with our colleagues in the state government and the feds around how, the remote communities would be closed, about how PPE and other, hand sanitizer would be brought into the Kimberley, but also in terms of, what would happen in the event of an actual pandemic event. So at that time, we used the levers that were created for us and by the Coalition of Peaks under the Priority Reforms 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap. Imagine for a second if we had our voice enshrined in the Constitution, which will be another lever of change, which will allow us to make sure that our communities and our voices remain front and centre in the way policies are delivered, in the way that services are delivered. I think for me, that's a really powerful thing, and it's a lever that we can all use in the future.
Kia, there's also a whole piece really going to what Bart was saying, by extension of that, around protocols of who speaks for who was at which tables and part of those conversations. Is that something that is still looming over this whole discussion?
Absolutely. I think we need to just kind of ground ourselves in the day-to-day challenges that a lot of our families and communities are grappling with. I was back home in the East Kimberley just a few weeks ago at a board meeting, and we were trying to have this conversation around what does the voice mean, and ultimately what we're seeing play out right now is how do I make sure that my kids have food on the table, that we're not going to become homeless? Oh, and by the way, what does this mean for me and my community? How can I make sure that when I raise an issue or I raise a suggestion around how to improve co-design of delivery or service delivery or better investment into our region, that it will be heard and that it's taken up, down and across by the right people. So I think there's lots of nuances. There's the gender piece coming back to cultural protocols. There's also the role of our elders and senior knowledge holders. And I do feel in some way that we've been distracted by the Western system of governance as opposed to community and cultural governance. And there is a question around, is this the opportunity now to work with the Australian people, of which we are, to come up with a model that better reflects our ancient ways of making decisions, of building communities that can thrive, even in uncertain times.
Do you think can it be both? Can it fit within the Western democratic construct and
We're
also
doing
be
it
deeply...
right now, Dan.
Yeah.
We have Aboriginal corporations that have had
Good point.
have had to fit into corporate governance models, regulations. You know, there's ASIC listed companies, so we're doing it already. I don't think it's a question of can they both exist. We are all proof.
But how they then coexist.
That's right. And the how is what is, I think, tangling a lot of people up at the moment, because in the absence of being able to answer the how, people then fill those voids with assumptions or misinformation. And that's where leadership from community, place-based decision-making grounded in cultural protocols becomes critically important.
Yeah, if I could add something to that as well, Dan, and that is from a Aboriginal health perspective, we don't consult, we negotiate. And what's going to be the challenge when we see this play out is how do we get the shift of power and resources from within government to Aboriginal community control? And I think that's really where the challenge is going to be.
It's an interesting point you make, Alan. Consult is a loaded term, isn't it?
Look, I just think of what Jenny's just saying. I can hear Auntie Pat Turner saying that recently. We are sick of being consulted. We want to negotiate. And I say we, not me. I'm a fortunate white fella with all the white privilege, but I'm very interested in what the three Aboriginal panellists have got to say, and I think we need to put more weight on Aboriginal voices than whitefellow voices in this debate. When I roam around the desert and go into remote communities, people don't talk to me about the voice. I've never had anyone talk to me about the voice, but I'm mindful of the fact that in my lifetime I haven't seen the gap close. I haven't seen things get much better in my working career for remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And one of the reasons for that is because there is no formal voice enshrined in the Constitution. So I don't think the voice is going to be a magic bullet that's going to solve all the problems in remote Australia. But I think that voting no to the voice can't advance equity for remote people. I don't think there's any benefit to voting no. I feel like voting yes is just a stepping stone to getting on with the real work of the things that Keir talked about, which is to have a voice enshrined in the Constitution so that, as Jenny said, that Aboriginal voices can be controlling, not just consulted.
But the flooding in the Kimberley also raised a few other issues recently, that possibly hundreds of Aboriginal people across the region weren't registered at birth. Is there a concern that there will be First Nations residents here and potentially elsewhere in the nation that won't get a chance to vote in this because of whatever the barriers, the systems of governance and policy have put in place?
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at the percentage of Aboriginal people that are actually enrolled to vote, and we all know that I think the stat of Aboriginal population within Australia is very low. What is it, 2.8? 3.6%. You know, is that going to tickle the consensus, the voting consensus around Australia? It's really we want to push towards the broader Australian public that are going to make the difference in this vote. I mean, hopefully that most of us Aboriginal people vote yes, because it is a stepping stone, and it is a step towards even it's another cog of decolonising Australia, which is still happening. So it is a step for the future and a positive future, but I think that the plea has to go out to the broader community, because there's the percentage that needs to get over the line. You know, that's the fact of the matter. That's the numbers, and we can all look at that. And maybe, you know, a lot of community members that I've spoken to that haven't been informed or feel that they haven't been informed, maybe it's time that, you know, they actually get up and start to look and inform themselves. We've got all the technology and resources to do it, instead of waiting around for people to come to us and tell us. And that's one thing that, you know, I put out to people that have come to me and said, I don't know nothing about it.
Kia, you were touching before about already being in the space around corporate governance. That's taken control, isn't it? There are some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like many Australians, that don't trust the government, that are in fact distrusting because of the policy levers that have been in place. How big of a deal is that going to be in navigating this vote, and then if it were to pass, the system, the voice that comes after?
It's going to be crucial, Dan. But I just want to take a step back to something that Bart touched on. We have real examples, current examples of how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have navigated the existing system. The Wiani Tangari report, that is a great example. The Women's Voices report, you know, it started back in 1986. And like many of the reports and recommendations that come out, very little action is often taken to then implement. So I'm seeing real change happen when we know what the system is and how to navigate it. For our mob in the Kimberley, though, we are contributing something like $3.5 billion to real GDP. Coming back to a point that Alan made, where does that go? Does it actually come back to investing in this region where we're not restricted by one and a half highways? You know, those things are really important. And if we don't create and provide opportunities for people to be informed or to have their voices heard, then we're simply, I guess, continuing to maintain the status quo and exclude people.
Well, we've only just scratched the surface, and unfortunately we are out of time. I'm so grateful that you've all joined me. Thank you so much. Thanks to our panel, Bart Pigram, Kia Dow, Jenny Bedford and Alan Gray. Have an excellent evening. Thanks for joining us here from Yarra Country. John Barron will be back with you tomorrow night.